New York City in the 1970s wasn't just a place, it was a mood. A heavy, sweaty, nicotine-stained mood that sat in your chest and made you wonder if the world was ending or just beginning. The streets had this fever dream quality, like they'd been scribbled by a kid who just found out what a black crayon could do. Crime was everywhere, the economy was in freefall, and the skyline to sag under the weight of it all. But there was a strange kind of freedom in that chaos, a sense that when the old rules broke down, you could rewrite them however you wanted. For better or worse, it was a city where anything could happen, mostly bad, but occasionally brilliant. The neighbourhoods were petri dishes of culture. In places like the Lower East Side, you'd find tenements filled with aspiring artists, junkies, and kids who still believed they could change the world, even if they didn't know how. Up in the Bronx, burned out buildings stood like monuments to neglect, but they weren't empty. They were alive with music and dance. Harlem was alive with a different rhythm, a pulse of resistance and reinvention. Everywhere you turned, there were people pushing against the walls the city had built around them, finding ways to carve out spaces for themselves and their communities. It was as if the city itself dared its residents to find new ways to thrive. You couldn't escape the tension in the air. This was a city simmering, every block pressure cooker ready to blow. It wasn't just the poverty or the failing infrastructure. It was the feeling that the city's problems weren't just urban, they were existential. Who are we? What are we building? Does any of this even matter? Those questions hung in the air like the smell of hot pretzels and gasoline. The answers came in bursts of creativity that were as gritty and unpolished as the streets themselves. Punk and rap weren't polished products. They were survival tactics, raw screams into the void from people who didn't see themselves in glossy magazines or mainstream music. Punk, with its snarling guitars and DIY ethos, was a rebellion against everything polished and prepackaged. It thrived in dive bars and underground clubs where the beer was warm and the sound systems barely worked. But that was the point. Imperfection was the aesthetic. Bands like the Ramones didn't care about solos or virtuosity. They cared about energy, about channeling frustration into something loud and unforgettable. Punk was a movement for the disenchanted, the angry, the outsiders who'd had enough of a world that seemed content to ignore them. Meanwhile, in the Bronx, rap was inventing itself in real time. DJs like Africa Bambaataa and Grandmaster Flash turned turntables into instruments, creating beats that felt like the pulse of the city itself. MCs turned those beats into stories, weaving together humor, pain, and braggadocio in rhymes that made you nod your head and think, yeah, I know that feeling. It wasn't about escape. It was about confrontation, about taking the harsh reality of life in the city and turning it into poetry. Rap wasn't just music, it was a mirror, reflecting the grit and beauty of a community determined to be heard. Despite their differences, punk and rap shared a kind of defiant authenticity. Both movements were born from necessity, from a refusal to sit quietly and wait for things to get better. And even though they came from different corners of the city, they were connected by the same electricity, the same sense that the old ways weren't working, so it was time to burn them down and start over. They were the voices of a generation that had been pushed to the margins, screaming and rhyming their way back into the spotlight. By the end of the decade, New York was still a mess, but it was a mess that had given birth to something extraordinary. The city had taken all its grit, diversity, and frustration and turned it into culture that would ripple out across the world. Punk and rap weren't just music. They were proof that even in the darkest times, creativity can thrive. And while the skyline may have been crumbling, the spirit of the city was indomitable, a testament to the beauty of resilience and the power of art to turn chaos into something timeless.